morning. Boker Tov, everyone. We'd like to get started. We have a wonderful program this morning and want to make sure that we can use all of our time together. Bruchim habayim, welcome. Blessed are all of you who've come for this event today, sponsored by Beth Emmet and J Street and Mishkan Chicago. I'm Rabbi Andrea London, the senior rabbi here at Beth Emmet, and it really is delightful to have you here for this really important conversation. Of course, none of us in this room are unaware of how difficult the last 8 months have been. Difficult for the Jewish community here and around the world. Of course, excruciatingly difficult for Israel and for the people of Gaza. There's been so much death and destruction. Hostages still being held in Gaza. Even though there are 4 that were recently released, we know that there are over 100 who are still being held, and we don't know how many of them are still alive. And we continue to have our hopes and our prayers that they will be released soon and be able to go back to their families in good health. And the destruction in Gaza and the amount of suffering there is immense. And every day, the first thing that I do is I look on Haaretz to see what's happened, and I always think, today is the day. The fighting will stop and the hostages will be released. And it's been hard every day to have that kind of hope when it continues to drag out. But our program today is really focused on the future, that we need a place of hope, and we need people who are having the difficult conversations of how do we get out from the situation we are in and to create a better future for Jews and for Palestinians and for everybody who lives in the Middle East. We know that the liberation of the Jewish people is bound up together with the Palestinians, and that without being in conversation and understanding their issues and narrative, that we'll never be able to live in freedom and in peace. And the same thing for the Palestinians. And those of us who are here in this room, I think, understand that reality and that truth. And J Street has been one of those organizations that has been on the forefront of bringing that message to the American Jewish community and saying we need to create a better future. If we want Israel to be stable, if we want people to live in safety and in freedom, and if we want real peace and justice and security for everyone. And so we dedicate our time together to that hope and to that vision, and that the suffering should end soon for all who live in the region. For those of you who don't know, J Street works in the American political system and works to use our political leverage to advance a diplomacy-first approach to bring lasting end to the conflict, which is why we don't want to keep this event in the realm of ideas, but bring it back to concrete ways in which these ideas can make their way into American policy. While some leaders seem to be failing at providing answers, there are people out there, even those in governmental positions, who are taking these questions seriously, that in a very dark world, there are some possible answers out there, and we hope to explore them together today. This moment, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the work of our own congregant and J Street champion. Where is Congresswoman Schakowsky? Oh, she's sitting right behind me. Now, I would say that that's not an appropriate place for the Congresswoman to be behind me, because I'm usually behind her. But the truth of the matter is that Congresswoman Schakowsky has been a dear friend and has been behind me and a great support. If you want to know how I've gotten through the last 8 months, this is the woman who has made so much of that possible, that she calls and checks in on me regularly, and we talk about how we can have hope for the future. But Congresswoman Schakowsky is not just behind me, but she's behind all of us and in front of all of us, leading the way to creating a more equitable society here in our own country, and cares so deeply about what happens in Israel and in Palestine. So she can only be with us for a few moments. She is going to be in a play today. So not only is she a congresswoman, but she's an actress. I didn't know that till just now. But she wants to say hello to everybody first. So
thank you. Thank you to my beloved Rabbi, Andrea London. And I just wanted to stop by and thank Sean Casten, my colleague in the Congress. We have been real great. We have been good partners with a number of people, and including many of the members in the Jewish community in the Congress, to try and address in the most equitable way what is happening, this terrible, terrible war that we're seeing. And Sean has been a very strong voice, a brave voice in his community, and I'm so grateful to J Street. J Street has changed my life over the last decade or more, and has really been such an incredible leader and continues to be so at this most difficult time. So this conversation is going to be very important. I'm so glad to see so many people that are here, and people who can spread the word about how we can have a good resolution if we work together, if our country would work together, for Israel, for the Palestinians, and that is a vision that we have. We need to stop the killing, we need to stop the war, and we need to be a strong Jewish voice and a progressive voice to make sure that we have peace, and hopefully as soon as possible. So I just wanted to say how grateful I am to all of you as participants, to J Street, to Beth Emmet, and to all the speakers that are going to be here. So thank you very, very much. I am 11 years ago, I started the voice of a powerful woman at the Black Ensemble Theater. It's just some elected officials who get together and make fools of ourselves. Fortunately, they also have professional, wonderful people who sing and, actually can perform. But I made this commitment, so I'm going to go. But my heart is with you. Thank you so much.
A sanctuary filled with Jan fans. So nice to be all together. So just a note about safety before we begin our program. You can see that we have an exit over on this side of the sanctuary, which will take you out to Ridge, and an exit on this side where you came into the sanctuary, which will take you back into the buildings. You see those two exits. There is a self-guided AED defibrillator located in the coat room, which is just past us over here. Many people from Beth Emmet know where that is. And do we have any medical personnel in the sanctuary? Raise your hand if you would be willing to agree to help us. Thank you. Thank you for identifying yourself just in case of an emergency. Please note that there is a feature on your cell phone which will allow you to make calls via the Wi-Fi in case of an emergency. So if you want to take a moment, we of course want you to put your phone on silent, but please put your phone on the Wi-Fi too in case there's an emergency. There's a guest network here at Beth Emmet, and let me give you the phone number for the guest network so you could make a call. It is our phone number here at Beth Emmet, which of course you all have memorized, 847-869-4230. Again, the password is 847-869-4230. So those were our emergency announcements. God willing, we will never have to use any of these things, but we always have to be as careful as we can. Now I want to introduce our moderator for today. Dr. Debra Shushan is the founding director of the J Street Policy Center. She also serves as scholar in residence and manager of congressional education. Previously, Dr. Shushan was the director of policy and government relations at Americans for Peace Now and held academic roles at the College of William and Mary and the Georgetown University School of Foreign Policy in Doha, Qatar. And she writes for J Street incredible position papers about what's happening. Debra is always a person I go to when I have a question or I'm in need or I need some consultation, and she's always so kind to respond to my texts and notes to her. But she is brilliant and knowledgeable and kind and wonderful, and it really, when they said Debra was going to come and facilitate this, I said anything for Dr. Debra Shushan, because I have so much respect and admiration for you and the work that you do and your incredible brilliance and knowledge about this area. And as Congresswoman Schakowsky has already said, we are so delighted also that the Congressman Sean Casten is with us today. We have quite an exciting lineup. So I'm going to invite Dr. Shushan to come up at this time to lead our panel. And then at the end, we'll also thank the rest of our J Street staff, our incredible staff that's here today.
Hello, Beth Emmett and guests who are with us today. It is really a pleasure to be here in Chicagoland with all of you, and really excited for this program. And also, thank you so much to Rabbi London for that incredibly kind introduction. As Rabbi London mentioned, I lead up something that we call the J Street Policy Center, which is a pretty new initiative at J Street, less than 2 years old. And one of the things that we do at the Policy Center is twice a year we hold policy symposia, and we convene policy experts, both based in the DC area who can join us in person, and also experts from Israel, Palestine, Middle East, Europe, et cetera, rest of the United States, who can join us over Zoom for very important policy conversations. And the one that we had in our most recent symposium, which was back in February, was on exactly the topic that we're going to be talking about today, creating a political horizon, a path forward for Israel-Palestine. This is something that we at J Street really started to think about as early as October 8th. Obviously, we were thinking about the horrific events of October 7th and what would come immediately after that, and we know that it's been a horrific war that has now raged for almost 8 months. But we also knew how important it was to think beyond the immediate and to how this horrific reality could be used, could be leveraged in a positive way to finally end this conflict that has raged for at least 75 years. And so that was the topic of our symposium back in February with a number of fantastic experts who joined us. We produced a symposium report after that. And so this is really the first time that we have taken the J Street Policy Center on the road. And I really want to thank Lance Friedman from here in Chicago, who had the idea of putting together a really substantive policy event here in Chicago. He did quite a lot of legwork to make this happen. And I also want to thank my Chicago-based J Street colleagues who have done so much work to make this happen, especially my colleague Marina, who is here somewhere making everything run smoothly and really done an incredible job. So let me just give you an idea of our plan for this morning, what it's going to look like for the next couple of hours. I'm going to start out by giving you a bit of a synopsis of the path that we at J Street have laid out as our vision for the path forward. We're then going to be joined by a couple of speakers who are going to share their expertise with us. We were actually going to have 3 speakers. Unfortunately, one of them, Ahmed Al-Khatib, has fallen ill and won't be able to join us, which is really a shame. He is a fascinating guy who, if you're not familiar with him, since he won't be able to join us today, really encourage you to look up his work. He has published a ton, especially since October 7th. He is a Palestinian American, originally from Gaza, left Gaza for study abroad in his teen years, and now lives in California. He is really an extraordinary guy who has, unfortunately, lost many family members in Gaza during this war, but has also really been a voice for peace and reconciliation, someone with a vision moving forward, who is not only very critical of the Netanyahu government, but also extremely critical of Hamas. And so I really do encourage you to look for his writings. He's written in The Forward, Atlantic, a number of other places, and his writings are really quite worthwhile. So I will have an opportunity to talk with two great speakers who I'm going to introduce in just a little bit. I also am lucky enough to have an opportunity after our discussion with our speakers who are joining us remotely to get to sit here and talk with Congressman Casten, who I'll introduce in a little bit. We really are extremely fortunate to have him with us today, and I'm very lucky to have a chance to actually interview him. Now, I just want to mention that we would like to make this as interactive as we can. So we will have opportunities, maybe not as long as we like, but we will have opportunities for audience questions, both of our speakers who are joining us virtually and also for Congressman Casten. So each of you will find at your seat note cards, either one or two note cards. And if you have questions during my conversation with our two panelists or during my conversation with Congressman Casten, please feel free to write your question on that note card. Then you can just raise it, and one of our volunteers will come and collect it and bring it over to me, and I will ask as many questions as we have time for. Just want to mention as well that after these two conversations, there will be some refreshments outside. Obviously, Jews cannot gather without food. That's just not allowed, as you all know. So we will have some refreshments outside. I really encourage all of you to stick around, enjoy the food, and to continue as well the conversation. So, so I want to start out the kind of substance here by providing you with a kind of a synopsis of J Street's vision for the path forward. Let me say this, that if you are intrigued and you want to read in more detail, of course you can do that. You can go to the J Street Policy Center webpage, jstreet.org/policy center. We make it really easy. And you can there access the symposium report that we put together following our February symposium. You can access all of the writing that we at the Policy Center have put out. And so I really do encourage you to do that. But in terms of the path forward that we at J Street introduced back in February, what we have done is to call on President Biden to speak out publicly, and we started to see a very important move in this direction with the president's speech on May 31st. We've encouraged him to put out his own vision, his own path for the way forward for Israel, for the Palestinians. And the suggestion that we made to the president is that he outlined 5 steps. And these are the 5 steps that we propose. The first step, of course, was for a ceasefire, a negotiated ceasefire that would facilitate the release of all of the hostages, that would enable the surge of humanitarian aid into Gaza, and that would also present a plan going beyond those immediate needs. And again, as I said, on May 31st, we saw the president announce a 3-staged plan for a 6-week ceasefire, then a more permanent ceasefire, and then for the rebuilding of Gaza. But what have we at J Street suggested that goes beyond that? What we've called on the president to embrace publicly is a vision for reconciliation and a new comprehensive regional security framework that would center a conditional offer to recognize a Palestinian state. U.S. policy for quite a long time has been and continues to be under the Biden administration that U.S. recognition of Palestinian statehood would happen, of course, right, if you favor a two-state solution, but that it would only happen after direct negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians and after an agreement, a bilateral agreement. But what we have embraced and really called on the president to do is say, if the Palestinians achieve a number of reform benchmarks, and I'll talk a little bit more about what we think those should entail, that the U.S. will go ahead and recognize Palestinian statehood. And at the same time, there should be another piece to this, which is a comprehensive regional security framework that will be anchored around normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, something that we know that the Biden administration was pursuing very seriously, even certainly before October 7th. What we've called on the president to do is really to speak directly to the people of Israel, to the Palestinian people, to give them a vision of hope going forward for how to actually finally end this conflict. And what we have said to President Biden is that this is something that is not only good policy, but it's also good politics. We all have seen how dramatically U.S. politics, relations between just within the Jewish American community have been dramatically affected over the last 8 months. And so moving forward in a way that will finally enable the solving of this heretofore intractable conflict is something that we've really encouraged. In terms of the remaining steps that we've suggested, so that's step one, and I'll try to go through the remaining steps a little bit more quickly. Second step would be for parallel moves to advance toward peace and security. So there would be a track with the Palestinians that would advance on a trajectory toward a number of key reforms, right? These would mean that the Palestinian leadership would commit to and begin implementing reforms that would include measures advancing democracy and better governance, reform to finances and the judiciary, combating corruption, overhauling the problematic prisoner payment program, changes in education, combating incitement, and ending harassment of Palestinian civil society and the media by the Palestinian Authority. In addition, we have called for the Palestinians to establish a new governing and transitional authority alongside the new Palestinian Prime Minister, Mohammed Mustafa. This would be until elections can be held. Crucially, there would be no role in this for Hamas. And the last piece of that would be for the Palestinians to agree to demilitarization or non-militarization of a Palestinian state, only with weapons for internal security and policing. Now, this would also involve a track with the Israelis, who would also be expected to show their interest in a path forward by doing a number of crucial things. These would include ceasing actions that undermine the Palestinian Authority, so things like withholding tax revenues that have the Palestinian Authority at the brink of collapse, and other measures that the Israeli government has been taking since before October 7th, but has continued to take measures that destabilize the West Bank, including moving forward with large number of plans for new settlement units, confiscation of additional territory, and then also, as part of these moves with the Israeli government, there would be a continued and very serious push to make sure that Israel is adhering to domestic and international law by facilitating a surge in humanitarian aid to Gaza, and also allowing, once a ceasefire takes hold, post-war reconstruction of Gaza, which is going to need to be a massive effort. I don't need to tell all of you the scale, of course, of the destruction of Gaza that has occurred within the last 8 months, which is, I think for most of us, really kind of difficult to even conceptualize or comprehend. The U.S. during this period would also be taking its own steps, which would include things like training and building capacity of Palestinian security forces that will continue their process of cooperation with Israeli security forces, and taking steps needed to facilitate a Palestinian security presence in post-war Gaza. So that's step number 2. Step number 3 would be the actual U.S. recognition of a state of Palestine. This would happen, again, following the determination by U.S. and European partners and others that Palestine has implemented the reform measures that had been agreed to. And we hope that the U.S. will recognize this Palestinian state in cooperation with other European states that have not yet taken this move. And I'm sure many of you are very well aware that just recently a number of European states have already, Ireland, Spain, Norway, and even after that Slovenia, have all just recently recognized Palestinian statehood. So we know that this is something that many European states are interested in, and we'd love to see the United States show leadership and take this step with remaining countries that have not yet recognized Palestinian statehood. We would call on the Arab League to reissue the more than 2 decades old Arab Peace Initiative that was initially spearheaded by Saudi Arabia. It's an initiative that's been on the table all of those years that has offered Israel full normalization with the entire Arab world in return for the establishment of a Palestinian state along the 1967 lines with land swaps. So that's something that we think is extremely important, that gets renewed and put back on the table. As part of this stage, there will need to be U.S. leadership working together with Arab countries, the G7 countries, the European Union, that all will work together to commit to participating in a Marshall Plan scale investment to redevelop, rebuild Gaza as well as the West Bank in order to make it possible for there to be a viable Palestinian state through this new transitional Palestinian authority that we've talked about, a revitalized Palestinian leadership. There would also be movement toward a new regional security architecture that would encompass Israel, Palestine, and key partners from the Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, crucially, Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, along with U.S. involvement. And we also think that as part of this process, there should be examined the possibility of a U.S.-led peace-enabling force along the borders of a new Palestinian state and along the borders of the potential new borders within Jerusalem. Step 4, crucial parallel negotiations. On the one hand, you have direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians along the parameters that would be set out in a new UN Security Council resolution on final status issues. This would involve, these direct negotiations would involve the participation of the US and also key interested international actors as part of this process. Note that as we have envisioned it, by this time already, the US would have recognized Palestinian statehood, so Palestine and Israel for the first time would come into these direct bilateral negotiations on a much more even footing than that was ever the case previously. The other parallel negotiation that would happen would be between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States along a track toward an Israeli-Saudi agreement that would have significant U.S. participation and likely would have agreements between the United States and Israel, the United States and Saudi Arabia, that would help to make all of this possible. And the final step, the fifth step, would be to, and here we have Congress come into this picture, there is outdated legislation that is still on the books that will need to be amended in order for Palestine to become a full member within the United Nations, which is part of Step 5. Currently, were that to happen, the U.S. would have to suspend its membership dues to the United Nations, which would be obviously incredibly detrimental in terms of U.S. leadership. Believe it or not, yes, that legislation is on the books, along with other problematic legislation that prohibits Palestinian diplomatic representation here in the United States. So the president would have to commit to and then work with Congress as part of this historic peace process to remove, to amend that outdated legislation that is still on the books. So that is our vision. It is one vision. Certainly a process does not have to follow exactly those lines, but we did want to put our ideas out there for how a fundamentally different and better future could move forward. Okay, I'm looking at the time. We're running a bit behind. So now, but that's okay because we have one less speaker than we did before, so we're going to make up that time. I am extremely excited to be able to introduce our two speakers who you now see on the screen in front of you there. But in order to save time, actually, I'm going to introduce them very, very briefly because you should all have their bios at your seats. And I do recommend that you take a look at their impressive bios. So what I'm going to do is just very briefly kind of give an idea of some guiding questions that we formulated for each of the speakers. They will then have an opportunity to share their opening framing thoughts with us for around 5 to 7 minutes each. And then I'll have a chance to maybe ask a follow-up question. We'll go to audience Q&A as well, as I promised. So please don't forget, while all of this is going on, if you have a question for our speakers, please don't hesitate to write it on a note card and lift the note card up. We're going to turn first to Aryeh Katsevich, who was kind enough to give us the pronunciation of his name ahead of time, so I hope, Aryeh, that I did get it right. Professor Katsevich is the Chaim Weizmann Chair in International Relations at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and since October 7th, he has been involved with a very important think tank that we at J Street love to work with, based in Israel, called Mitvim. He's been working with the Mitvim team that has been designing its own plans for the aftermath of the war and put out something that they have referred to as the Israeli Initiative. So turning to Professor Katsevich, I would love for him to tell us a little bit about the Israeli Initiative. And if he so chooses, some of the other questions we had in mind for him would be to talk to us a little bit about the views and the role of the broader Israeli public right now. We just had, of course, a major event that occurred yesterday with the rescue of 4 Israeli hostages who had been held in Gaza, along with in the process of a raid that also tragically killed a substantial number of Palestinians. We also expect Benny Gantz to be making a speech probably right around the end of our event, and the expectation is that he's going to leave the war cabinet. So big events happening all the time. And another one of the questions that, if he has time, would love for him to address is whether, in order to achieve the Israeli initiative that Mitvim has had envisioned, does the ultra-right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu need to be replaced in order to achieve peace, and what happens if they're not? What happens if they remain in power? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Katsevich.
Hello, I hope you can you hear me in Chicago at Beit Emet?
We
Can
can
you hear me?
hear you, but it's a little quiet. I don't know if do our tech people have the volume like all the way up?
Well, I hope you can hear me, Debra. I mean, the audio is not the best. So shalom from Tel Aviv.
Okay.
And thank you for hosting me. From what I hear, Debra, when you were summarizing the J Street position, it's not very different. We are not reinventing the wheel. So you asked me to share with you very briefly. I'm supposed to talk for 5 to 7 minutes, which is a challenge to any academics to stick to that time. But the Israeli initiative pretty much, I would say, overlap the vision that J Street and many other groups from civil society or academics we share regarding the day after. You could say it's a kind of a roadmap for visit 20 years later, and it's based on a three-stage, three-stage plan. Starting, as you were saying, we should start obviously with trying to end this war with the ceasefire and the release of the hostages, followed by the convening of an international peace conference within an international regional framework, and asking the parties for a commitment to a political horizon. The Israel initiative then considered a transitional phase for 2 to 3 years, where you have to stabilize and promote the Palestinian statehood, a transfer of control, a rehabilitation, reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, in a sense, rebuilding a revitalized Palestinian authority, and a series of confidence-building measures by Israel, and the third phase that is considered, again, along the lines of what you were talking. I mean, I have problems in hearing, but guessing, I know what is the J Street position. The third phase would be 1 to 2 years of negotiations leading to a two-state solution and also to a regional framework that might include peace and normalization with Saudi Arabia, the Arab countries according to the Arab Peace Initiative. Now, the second question regarding the border Israel public right now, and I know English, but I'm trying to understand whether the reference is regarding not the positions of those of us who have our own biases, but the other parts of the Israeli public opinion. Don't take me as representing the Israeli public opinion at all. So you have a significant segment in the Israeli population that, in a sense, they echo the messages of the current government, in a sense, calling for a total victory, which is completely unreal. Yesterday, we had a glimpse of a different mood because, as you know, and you follow that with this operation, you might say a kind of mini Entebbe after the Yom Kippur, the release of 4 hostages showed the solidarity of the people. So I would say that you might still have a consensus where the majority of the Israeli public opinion would prefer a hostage deal releasing the remaining hostages, because you cannot release, so far there have been 7 hostages released by military means. In the first step, the hostage deal that we had in last November, you have about 120, and there are remaining 120 hostages as well. So I would say that the public opinion is split. The right-wing bias support still going on. There was no Benny Gantz speech, of course, yesterday because he had to postpone that. So we had to wait and see whether Benny Gantz and his party, they will leave government. And then you ask me whether Netanyahu and the current government has to be replaced in order to achieve peace. Well, that's a very easy answer to answer because the answer is positive. I mean, I don't think that at this stage, Netanyahu, even if he wants, I mean, he might change the government, but having his partners from the ultra-right, that would not be a possibility. Now, if they remain in power, and if there is not going to be a deal within the next week or so, and I'm looking at you at the U.S., I'm looking at the United Nations Security Council, I know what there is a possibility of Chapter 7, which is a kind of imposition to end the war and release the hostages. So we might see even an escalation of the ongoing war at a kind of low level between Israel and Hezbollah into a full-fledged war. So the continuation of the government, the continuation of the current situation, that might mean a catastrophe, as I see. I'm sorry, I'm pessimistic on that, dimension, but I think just to end my short intervention, you may say that Israel is staying at a kind of crucial crossroad of what we, in our academic jargon, we call a moment of a hurting stalemate, what it's called ripeness. And Israel has to decide what to do. And there are two options right here. There is the option that is offered by the US, by the European community, by most of the Arab countries, by Jordan, by Egypt, which in a sense is trying to save Israel from itself. The default option, the second one, which will be more of the same, which is exactly what Hamas wants, which is to continue this war into a guerrilla war. That's why I'm saying I'm biased, but I come to this conclusion out of my analysis as a peace scholar for 31 years. There is now an opportunity to come out of this tragedy for Israelis and for Palestinians and to try to think about a political horizon. I will be happy to take questions, but they have to be formulated in chat because the audio at the Beit Knesset is not the best. Thank you.
Thank you so much, RAA. And I do apologize for, I know that our Chicago team has done the absolute, sorry? What happened? Am I muted? Okay, we're all right. I'm hearing we're okay. I follow anything that Noah over there tells me, and he's telling me we're okay. There's a different thing. Don't worry. I know you're Jews. You worry. You can't help it. It's okay. Okay, folks. So I do apologize. Our Chicago team has done everything they can to get the audio as good as it can be, and I know it's not perfect, but thank you so much to Professor Katsevich for those initial thoughts. I am going to warn you all that if I don't get any note cards, I'm just going to ask my own questions. So, if you're okay with that, all right, but, I do see some note cards raised. Fantastic. Okay, so next we are going to turn to the brilliant Farah Badur, who I'm pleased to be able to call a friend. She is the John Lewis Peace Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, and you can read her full bio that you have at your seat. She's the director of a Jordanian think tank based in Amman that provides policy analysis and recommendations to the strategic community in Jordan and abroad. And so we're very lucky to have Farah today. And she's going to give us some thoughts and comments and some of the things that, if she has time in her comments, we'd love to hear from her, are about the views of the Jordanian public at this time, a crucially important country that, of course, has had a peace treaty with Israel for about 3 decades now. The Jordanians, as well as the broader Arab public, whether she thinks that Saudi-Israeli normalization could be leveraged to potentially bring about a 2-state solution, what would be Saudi Arabia's price for normalizing relations with Israel, and which international actors she sees as likely willing to take the lead in being willing to contribute substantial amounts of money in developing a new Marshall Plan that would make possible the rebuilding of Gaza and a new Palestinian state. So with all of that, Farah, I turn it over to you for some comments.
Thank you, Debra. Good to see you. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I have to say that I share Ari's pessimistic reading for the war right now. And before talking about the Saudi leverage and or maybe limitations, I would like to take a step back and understand where we are today in order to assess whether any future plans will have, potential or prospects or not. And I want to go back to the beginning of the war, when Israel declared three primary objectives. First, to destroy Hamas governance and military capabilities, to bring back the hostages, and to create a new security reality for Israel in the region. Now, almost you said 8, but I said 9 months later, Israel succeed when it comes to the first objective, but not necessarily for the other two. Israel succeed in destroying half of Hamas military capabilities, making the group incapable of launching another large-scale attack like the one on October 7th. Having said that, on the ground, Hamas has adapted to the Israeli operations with guerrilla tactics. The group remained resilient. They showed that they could continue to recruit new militants and forcing the IDF to re-enter areas previously declared cleared. And there are many reports that indicate that Hamas remains organized and capable of exercising forms of security and forms of governance in pockets around the Strip. And this means that for the foreseeable future, Hamas will be able to respond to the Israeli operations in the Strip for months, during which Israel will continue its operation in a highly densely populated area, leading to more tragic incidents like the recent attack in Nusayrat refugee camp. And on the other hand, each day without a deal sees the number of living hostages decrease. Yes, there was an operation, successful operation for rescuing refugees yesterday, but many reports, and according to the hostages, they said that their number of refugees are being killed by the Israeli attack. So this is something that we have, to consider. And there are many scenarios for how the war will evolve, whether we're talking about the day after or the day between leading to the day after. But as the war continues, there is the collapse of law and order in Gaza will deteriorate, and that will complicate the security and governance environment, leading to the erosion of the social cohesion in the Strip. And these elements could lead Gaza in a number of directions. But one concerning direction that this is an environment that will be fertile for new forces to emerge, forces that we do not have a good read of. And when we are talking about Hamas controlling pockets around the Strip, and we are talking about new players in town, coupled with lack of security, lack of governance, catastrophic humanitarian situation, and of course there is a lack of hope. We are talking about right elements for a civil war recipe. Already we have some commentators have referred to Gaza as Somalia on the Mediterranean, while recently I heard yet another description by a very wise analyst, Mona Yakubian, describing one of scenarios as Fallujah on the Mediterranean, and referring to a context where insurgency and civil war overlaps in a highly complex environment. And to make matter more complicated, the occupation of the Philadelphia corridor and the presence of the Israeli forces at the Rafah crossing, risking violating the strategic peace that Israel has with Egypt, and the proximity of the Egyptian and the Israeli soldiers in such highly volatile situation has already led to friction, evidenced by the exchange of fire at the Rafah crossing that resulted in the death of the Egyptian soldier. And that really opens a whole conversation about future spillover into Egypt and how that could destabilize one of Israel's strategic security partners. Meanwhile, and this is something Ari referred to, is the situation on the north, with Lebanon is becoming increasingly volatile. Hezbollah has linked the situation in the north to what's going on in Gaza. Both sides want to avoid escalation, but it seems that this is unavoidable. As the situation worsens in Gaza, Hezbollah rockets and drone attacks escalate. Just recently, the IDF Chief of Staff Halevi hinted that there is an imminent offensive in Lebanon. Leaving this front and going to the West Bank, the situation is also volatile. The Palestinian Authority is on the verge of collapse, exacerbated by, as what you said, Deborah, cutting funds to the PA. There is a rising settlers attack and provocation at Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Palestinian political landscape, of course, is further complicated by their historic, divisions and making it difficult to envision a cohesive strategy looking forward. I don't know what we could expect from the next reconciliation meeting that will take place in China, or actually moderated by China, will bring to the table. But as the way I read it, there is no prospect for that reconciliation. And the situation in the West Bank is getting worse and will have a ripple effect on Jordan, yet another strategic partner to Israel. So overall, without a meaningful diplomatic intervention, we will continue to be caught in this escalatory spiral, war of attrition, worsening of a humanitarian situation. And I really appreciate J Street pushing for, formulating policy. And I think what we have seen recently with U.S. stepping in with proposing a ceasefire and hostages release plan. They want to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza that will facilitate aid and bring back the hostages and all the points that you referred to, Deborah. And the rationale that will de-escalate the situation with Hezbollah in the north and build momentum to sustain ceasefire and stabilize the situation in the West Bank and Egypt, which is a really good and rational, line of thinking. And it seems that Biden administration want to be more assertive. The recent Biden public speech signaled a shift away from the administration earlier approach of constructive ambiguity, which stretched enough to the point that it's not working anymore. The new approach of Biden administration, and rightly so, aims to press both Hamas and Israel to be transparent with their constituents. And how efficient is the new approach? We have to wait and see. But it seems that we don't have a lot of options that that we could move forward. And the question from where I am, from the region or sitting in Jordan, that this boils down to the question about how more assertive Biden can be and how much pressure the Biden administration can exert on Israel in an election year. And after answering this question, we can move and addressing key components of any future deal. That any future deal has to have a political process that should aim to have a credible pathway leading to a two-state solution and ensuring that the PA is empowered and has the capacity to govern effectively. And just recently, the US had proposed a statement titled Joint Statement on the Principles to Support a Future of Peace for Israelis and Palestinians. And it's a document that has 10 points that included what you just mentioned earlier, Deborah. But the problem with this document, that first, it does not include any international terms of reference, which really makes it hard to envision how we're going to have a credible path towards a two-state solution when we don't have these points. That there is no clear implementation mechanisms, how we are going to do that, and we need to articulate a strategy for post-war in order to achieve that. And while Mr. Bibi Netanyahu is saying that no Hamas, no Abbas, and he refused to say that, I find it really difficult to understand how we could talk about plans in the future without really pushing the parties to articulate their visions for the post-war scenarios and order. And the most important thing, from my opinion, that anything that it's not linked and bound to a timetable is bound to fail. Because we have learned from the past that this is something is crucial and important to achieve progress. And going to your question about Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia has made it very clear that normalization with Israel is conditioned on the establishment of a credible path toward a Palestinian state. Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farhan stated that this is something that serves not only the interest of Palestinians, but also delivers the security that Israel needs and Israel deserves. But for Saudis, the definition of the term credible path is informed by two experiences, by Oslo and by the Abraham Accords. And from their perspective, a credible path must avoid a repeat of the Oslo Accords scenario, where signing these accords did not lead to an actual realization of the Palestinian state. And a credible path must also avoid the Abraham Accords scenario, where these accords has been criticized for failing to produce a meaningful progress in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So the Saudis are cautious about not repeating these mistakes. So before talking about Saudi's leverage, let's shed the light on the Saudis' limitation. The Saudi leadership understand that they need to legitimize their relationship with Israel through their public opinion, which is sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. And we can talk about, for hours about the public opinion and the misinformation, but that's what they are seeing. Palestinians view Saudi Arabia as the only rescue at this moment, and the Saudis are very sympathetic to the Palestinians when it comes to this point. So that means that the leadership in Saudi Arabia will not put itself in a position that might backfire domestically. And they rather, not to risk and rush a deal with Israel. They will only focus on playing a role in future reconstruction. We can talk about who can do that and when and how, but meanwhile, they will focus on bilateral negotiations with the US and come up with creative arrangements that would pave the way for a defense agreement with the US or a nuclear cooperation. So where do I stand right now? I don't see that the window for making any meaningful change in this situation is really slim. And while everyone is looking at Saudi Arabia as the savior, we have to understand that they have also domestic calculations that they have to consider before, saying that the Saudi-Israeli normalization will be like a win horse in this whole drama.
Thank you so much for that analysis, Farah. That was wonderful. Great food for thought. So in terms of questions, and thank you so much, I received a large number of note cards. I knew we weren't going to get up to all of the questions. Let me just say, I have a number of questions that I'm putting aside. And this is a batch of questions for J Street about our positioning. I'm going to put these aside because I welcome the opportunity to continue the conversation with J Street regarding our positioning, our support, all of that. Please continue the conversation with me and my Chicago J Street staffers after this. There's plenty of opportunity for that. The questions I have here in my hand are specifically for our speakers. And I know they won't be able to address even the questions I have here in my hand, but I'm gonna lay out the kind of questions on the table, give them each a chance to speak and speak to what really grabs them. So we'll give each of them a chance to speak for 5 minutes. Sorry, I know that's not a lot. And then we will thank our two fantastic speakers. So let me lay out the questions. We have a couple of questions, of course, regarding Israel and its positioning and role in terms of path forward. One of them, question about how to address the political strength within Israel of the settlers. Is there something that could be done to detract from their strength in order to make sure that there's sufficient support within Israel for a plan going forward? And then the second question that kind of leads from there is, well, if we can't accomplish anything with Israel, given the domestic political situation, can we accomplish anything without Israel? So that's a couple of questions there. On the Palestinian side, one question is, isn't it time to support Palestinian civil society groups, such as women's organizations, that could provide a counterweight to the role of terrorist groups like Hamas, question about what happens to the thousands of Hamas members and their families in a post-war situation, question about the potential of the establishment of democracy in a future Palestinian state. The questioner is skeptical about that possibility. And now we have a question about U.S. policy and what role control or a change in U.S. weapons policy of selling certain military weapons to Israel, what role that could play in all of this. And then we have an interesting question that often will come up that if our speakers would like to speak to, question of the possibility of a truth and reconciliation process after the end of a war between Israel and the Palestinians versus the possibility of criminal prosecution. Obviously, we see that in play with the ICC now. So a lot of great questions from our audience. I know that our speakers can't address them all, so I'm going to let you pick from that menu. Who wants to volunteer to go first? Aryeh, you got it. Go for it.
Okay. I'm reading the questions in chat. Debra, the audio is a metaphor of how we are staying right now. Very quickly, the question regarding the political strength of right wing in Israel, it's a complicated one because it depends how you define the political right. The political right, even if you consider right or center, might be the majority in the Knesset. But you know, even although I think the levels are dwindling, the prime minister is very unpopular. I mean, you could find a majority of the Israelis, but that might include many segments of the political right that they are not satisfied. And I'm saying this in euphemistic terms with the, not just October 7th, but even the mismanagement since then, because it's clear and it's evident that he's thinking about his own political horizon, not the political horizon of the country. But one thing that it has to be clear to the audiences in the US is that even though it might be the case that Netanyahu will no longer be the prime minister, that does not mean that there is no a majority in the political right in Israel, because there is a range of positions. If you ask about the extreme political right also represents a part of the Israeli public opinion, but I want to believe, and it's not just wishful thinking, that this is just a minority of the population. Just to give you an example, we saw last week that the two ultra-Orthodox religious parties that you might say they are part of the right, finally they are supporting the possibility of an hostage deal. Regarding the question about and if that's fine, Farah, I mean, I can take the free and then you can take the free in a different version from your standpoint. Well, you know, Israel is pretty much dependent upon the provision of weapons by the US. And I think here I can be partisan because I don't have to vote in November, you have to. But I think that President Biden, and he says that openly, you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. He has been so incredibly supportive of Israel, and I would say trying to save Israel from itself. I was raised in a Catholic country in Argentina, so you talk about the Pope as the vicarious. I think that for me, President Biden, well, maybe I'm taking an extreme position. He's the representative of God on earth. I mean, he's incredible what he has been doing. No, it's clear, and the U.S. has said that, President Biden and the Secretary of State, that they will look carefully regarding the use of U.S. weapons in this war. Now, I don't think that the way of starting an embargo against Israel would convince Israel. That's why I mentioned in my previous remarks that I would, and I think this might happen in the next few days, that the UN Security Council option should be tried. And you may say, well, Chapter 7 will not end the war. I don't know about that, but I can tell you the Yom Kippur War ended with Chapter 7, 338. Then you needed 339, 340, because it took Israel 3 days to accept that resolution. And you have a problem in imposing a United Nations Security Council resolution upon Hamas, which is not a sovereign state. But I think that's the way to go, and not regarding the policy selling weapons, or at least that should not be done openly. Regarding the Truth and Reconciliation process, we are probably looking at the question that should come later on. I mean, reconciliation, that's what we had in South Africa. You have that in Colombia. We don't have a civil war, although this reminds a bit of a civil war. I'm not ruling out truth and reconciliation, but the first step, first thing first, should be to stop the war, to release the hostages, to replace Hamas. And Farah, she was referring to that Israel could dismantle the infrastructure, but the only way to defeat Hamas is by offering a better political alternative for Palestinians and Israelis. There has to be a place for truth and reconciliation, but that should come after the war. You have to consider that both Israelis and Palestinians, we are under an incredible trauma. The two peoples, what they need, we need psychiatric treatment. And I'm seeing that seriously. Truth and reconciliation should come, but that should come after peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aryeh. Farah, over
Yes,
to
very
you.
quickly, and I'm sorry I have to hop on another meeting. I have to disagree with you, Ari, when it comes to truth and reconciliation. I'm working with the civil society organization that focus on people-to-people, interactions between Israel, Palestine, and the region. And it's true, like the civil society have, suffered from political, oppression, and sometimes by social oppressions. And yet, after October 7th, they suffered as the rest of, all of us, suffered from the aftermath of this tragic event. But also they showed resilience, and they showed willingness to work together. And I can share, I wish we have more time, but I can share many stories about Palestinians and Israelis coming together, regardless of the horrific thing that happened on October 7th and the horrific thing that is taking place in Gaza right now. They're coming together and they are charting a new future. So I disagree with you. Truth and reconciliation could start, right now, and we do not need to wait for a political, top-down political, resolution in order to start. In contrary, these grassroots movements can actually pressure leaders in the future to take, a political horizon. There is a very interesting question about the role of Hamas and what's gonna happen. I think this is this is a very smart question. You are pinpointing on the whole thing, because at the end of the day, we really need to manage our expectations about Hamas involvement in any future for Gaza. Even Hamas knows that they will not directly play a role, but that does not mean that they will not have a veto on any future plans, and which means that there is a lot of thinking and planning should be around how to achieve consensus with Hamas, and what does that mean. And again, without a strategy for post-war, without a clear plan, we cannot have these conversations. But I think this is a very important question that we all need to engage in at this point. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much to our fantastic speakers. We are so pleased to have you two share your expertise with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure having this panel with you. We have the conversation, but you have to run away, because the question is what has to come first, peace or reconciliation, where we have to wait for reconciliation first and then peace, or first peace and then reconciliation. That's the egg and the chicken question.
All right, well, thank you so much, Professor Katsevich, and we are really very lucky to have you and Farah Badour with us today. Thank you so much. All right, we're gonna do a quick change here, and we're going to bring Congressman Casten up to the front. So we're gonna do a little furniture change, And while we do the furniture change to speed things along, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the Congressman. And I believe you also have his bio, although I imagine for this crowd, really probably no introduction is needed. I'm now sitting next to Congressman Sean Casten, who represents Illinois' Cook and DuPage counties. He became the first Democrat to represent the 6th District in 70 years, Mazel Tov. Well, it's information, 50 years, Mazel Tov, that's fantastic. I'm sure you all know this, but I think it's pretty amazing that he's one of only a handful of scientists in the House of Representatives as an engineer by training. Powerful voice on climate change. I know that's an issue that is near and dear to so many of our hearts. So thank you for your leadership on that. But in addition, so Congressman, maybe when you came to Congress, you weren't expecting to be a leader on issues of Israel-Palestine, but you have now traveled with J Street on 2 congressional delegations to Israel and the West Bank, which is really phenomenal. First in 2022, and then in February of this year, so post-October 7th, joining 5 of your colleagues on J Street's first congressional delegation following the start of the Israel-Hamas war. So I'd love to ask you, as a congressman, what navigating, I know this is a huge question, but what navigating this issue, as someone who maybe didn't come into Congress thinking that this was going to take a lot of your time, what that's been like for you? Has J Street been able to serve as a resource for you and other members of Congress? And what is the temperature of Congress like on this issue right now? Why don't we start with those questions?
It's a very meaty set of questions. So number one, thank you so much for having me. Just a pleasure to be here, and thank you. I can't thank J Street enough for what you all do. I've actually taken 3 trips to Israel since getting elected. The first one was with another group when I first got elected.
What group would that be? I can't imagine.
And I did the first J Street trip mostly because I felt like I wanted to get a complete picture. And I tell all my colleagues, you should do the APEC trip and the J Street trip, because you see different things. We didn't spend, to the extent we spent any time in the West Bank on the APEC trip, it was to go to Ramallah to meet with Mahmoud Abbas. It wasn't to go, see, the realities of what's happening with settler violence and those other pieces. I would also say that on the APEC trip, you spend a lot more time at the Christian sites, and that's a rich conversation of why that is. But among those of my colleagues who are looking forward to being raptured, it's important to see where that will take place, I guess. But I think in combination, it's an issue we vote on a lot. It's an issue that it's maybe one of the few foreign policy issues that Americans actually care about in a sometimes informed way. And I just felt like as a member of Congress, I needed to have that complete perspective of what was going on there.
Great. Let me just remind all of you as well that you also have the opportunity to ask questions of Congressman Casten. So I see we already have 1 note card in the air, a couple of note cards up here. Again, feel free to write your questions and hold your note cards up. So Congressman, what's the temperature like in Congress now, among the 2 parties, but also within the Democratic Party? And I know here we are in Chicago, getting ready for the Democratic Convention, expecting maybe some issues. Yeah.
So let me start, and I've shared this with some of you before. I think on this issue, the dynamic within the 2 parties is that within the Democratic Party, there is and I speak to the Democratic Party in Washington. I don't mean to say every Democrat in the world, but within Washington, there's a tolerance for Democratic members who are not fully on board with Zionism, as long as that doesn't trip into anti-Semitism. Ilhan Omar gets called out when she says things that are anti-Semitic, but her views on Zionism are tolerated. It's the exact opposite in the Republican Party. There is tolerance for a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism as long as it doesn't trip into anti-Zionism. And I'm not saying that pejoratively. That is the practical reality. When I did that first APAC trip, There was a Democratic delegation, there was a Republican delegation. We overlapped by 2 days. And on one of those days, we went and met with Netanyahu, which was appropriate to be respectful of his time. I asked our guides, was there anything that you expressly did not include in the joint meetings? And this is an AIPAC representative. He said, yeah, we couldn't do Yad Vashem on a bipartisan basis. Exactly, right? And when we asked why, all of a sudden it became obvious, because the first thing you see when you walk into Yad Vashem is pictures of what was going on in Germany in the 1930s, and there's a big cartoon that looks exactly like the cartoon that Kevin McCarthy had just tweeted, but with George Soros replacing the Rothschilds. And I agreed. I said, yeah, that would have been really awkward for me to stand next to Kevin McCarthy and pretend to respect his sorry ass in front of that picture, right? And like, that's a real tension, right? That you can be, you can double down on someone who has dinner with Nick Fuentes, whose son-in-law submits this Swiss cheese map of Area C, because it's fine to be anti-Semitic as long as you're a Zionist. And I think that tension, we're going to see it on July 24th, right? We see it get weaponized. I think within the Democratic Party, there's and some of my colleagues say things that I wish they wouldn't, to be clear, but I think there's a healthy conversation going on that treats Israel the way that I think we treat the United States. That beautiful Frederick Douglass line I use it all the time, and now I got to remember it. The best friend of a nation is he who most faithfully rebukes her for her sins, and he, her worst enemy, who seeks to excuse, palliate, or defend them under the specious garb of patriotism. And finding ways for us as a country to say we are absolutely, undyingly an ally of Israel, but that does not mean that every leader of Israel has our affection, that every political party in Israel shares those same ends. And how do we have that conversation? I think that's a healthy conversation in the same way we have it in America. I love the United States. I detest Donald Trump. Those things are not incompatible, right? And how do we have that same conversation with respect to the Ben-Gvirs and Smotriches and Hilltoppers and that movement while still loving the nation of Israel and making sure that we want to preserve it?
Thank you so much, Congressman. So I'm starting to get questions up here from the audience. I'm sure there will be more. One of them puts you on the spot here a little bit and asks you about the question of military aid and U.S. weapons to Israel. What's your position? Do you think that there should be any restrictions, limits, certain weapons that shouldn't be transferred? Obviously, there was just the administration's report on NSM, National Security Memorandum 20. If you have thoughts on that you want to share, but the question of weapons to Israel.
Well, so, first let's just acknowledge the voting record. In this last term, we voted twice against aid to Israel. The first time was because it was stapled to defunding the IRS. The second time because it was not accompanied with humanitarian aid to Gaza. And that was a big deal. And I think it's a sign of progress that you could have those votes with some of the nuance in a normal way. And it's not running attack ads against anybody who did that. The recent curtailment of these huge 2,000-pound bombs, this was a very, very narrow constriction of aid. It got a lot more attention than I think it was warranted, but as Jim Himes, the head of the Intel Committee, pointed out to us, he said, this is a bomb that has a kill radius of 400 yards. Walk 4 football fields from here and ask yourself whether that's a weapon that is needed in this moment. So I think it's appropriate there. I think the larger conversation, and this goes to a lot of what your other speakers said, we have a ton of conversations around who would be a political leader that would be supported by the Palestinian people who would sort of, come from the more moderate wing of that society, but be able to carry out that peace. And I think it's an appropriate conversation, and people much savvier than me on diplomacy think a lot about that. It's also a very anti-democratic idea, right? We don't trust the people you elected in 2006, so we want to try to figure out how to bring other people in. And this is a little, I got to be careful saying this, we kind of need to have the same conversation on the other side of the green line. What should the United States do to make it possible for more moderate voices in Israel to be more powerful, and to be politically credible? Because going from Netanyahu to Benny Gantz is you're not at Ehud Barak at that point, right? What does that look like? And I think some of those military aid conversations, I think, are a useful part. I'm not saying this is all intentional, but I think it's a useful part of a larger conversation that says, how do we get to a point where the next time there is an election in Israel, the average Israeli says the United States is an ally, but they are an ally that is stronger if we elect person A than person B. And what does that look like tangibly? That's not just about military aid. I think there's a lot of other pieces to that, but I think it's important to be sending that signal, and I think it's been appropriate that we've been able to have that conversation publicly right now, in all its messiness.
Thank you, Congressman. I will say I've got a note here that says, ask the Congressman to speak up a little bit, please. So if you could do that as much as you can, thank you so much. And we have a really interesting question here, and I think an important one. What would you say to young people within the Democratic Party who would traditionally support the Democrats who feel that the party is not listening to their voices on this issue?
So let me answer the question as someone who has had my house surrounded by protesters 3 times. I cannot publicly notice events anymore because they get shut down. And I did say to one of the young people afterwards, "Why are you coming at me?" And he said, "Because we think you're gettable." And I said, "Okay, so I'm not going to tell you how to protest. You've got plenty of righteous anger at this, but you're coming at somebody who was calling on Blinken to stop demolitions of homes in East Jerusalem. You're coming at someone who has been very supportive of the financial sanctions against the Yinat levies of the world, because I'm not as good as you'd like, and you're driving me to basically say whatever view you have, we're not going to have a conversation with a bullhorn and a camera being live streamed to TikTok." And so I think a part of the conversation with young people is like, define what your goals are you want to achieve, and then figure out what your strategy is to make sure that you're bringing those goals forward. Because I think for a lot of us who care about this issue, including President Biden, I think there's a sense that there's important work to be done. There are sophisticated issues that matter. And if you have concluded that this, depending on your time frame, 75 to 2,000-year-old conflict is going to be resolved by signing on to Cory Bush's ceasefire resolution, you are not a serious person, right? There's nuance and sophistication here, and I think it's hurting a lot of the people who are sort of righteous on these issues, and we share a lot of the same goals. If they end up saying, well, we can't have you in the conversation when we're thinking through this because you're not a constructive partner. And that sounds very preachy, like, telling you how to protest. There's no right way to protest. But I think there is a question of, are you moving people towards your position or alienating them? When I had to get out and walk the last mile to O'Hare and missed my flight, I did not meet a lot of people in O'Hare who said, yeah, they're really turning me around on this issue right now. Right?
No, thank you so much for that. That's a really thoughtful answer. And I know, obviously, you're not alone in terms of members of the Democratic Party in Congress who are getting protested at their homes, including members who, we at J Street think are extremely constructive on this issue.
One just down the street from here.
Congressman Schakowsky, right? Exactly the same thing. And, if you're protesting Sean Casten and Jan Schakowsky, they're really question. But so let me kind of pose a follow-up.
The other thing that I'd put on that is, I think getting folks to understand, if Biden doesn't win, go look at Jared Kushner's peace plan, right? read up on what Sheldon Adelson's view is of the world, because that's what you're getting, right?
So let me follow up on this. Let me follow up on this and ask if in some ways does J Street provide another example of how you can potentially move members of Congress? Have you seen that yourself? Have you seen anything from J Street that's been effective? Can you comment on the role of the congressional delegations and whether that plays an important role in moving members who join us forward?
So only speaking for myself, if I have said anything today that you think, boy, that sounds smart, it's something I learned on a J Street trip. I'm not saying that the resources from if you've never toured East Jerusalem with Danny Seidemann, do it, like, to understand what's going on there. Spending time, I was with Yehuda Shaul last week, from the founder of Breaking the Silence. These fascinating conversations that actually led to a follow-on conversation at the White House picnic with senior members of Treasury about how are the sanctions regime impacting things on the ground in the West Bank, with some of the sanctions of some of these settlers. What do we need to do? What tools do we have diplomatically to try to maybe steer money into the Palestinian Authority that doesn't need Smotrich's sign-off? Like, all of those conversations would not be happening in Congress right now but for J Street.
Thank you. I'm glad that you mentioned the sanctions, and which of course came from President Biden's executive order that he issued on February 1st. And I remember a little bit before that executive order was issued, one of the things that we at the Policy Center get to do that's exciting and fun is to talk with members of the diplomatic community, foreign diplomats who are in DC. I was talking with a Japanese diplomat about what might be possible in terms of visa bans, potentially sanctions. He thought I was absolutely insane. And then, sure enough, the February 1st EO came out. I mean, that really was groundbreaking. And so I do appreciate you raising that and the impact that it has the potential to have if it's really fully utilized. It's an incredibly potent tool if it's used to its fullest extent. If folks want to read more about it, go to the J Street Policy Center website, and we've got an issue brief on the EO, which really is an extremely powerful tool.
Just a little story about that. So we were there just after that was signed, and we were meeting with one of the kibbutzes that had been relocated to Tel Aviv after October 7th, and as we were wrapping up, I asked the woman who was our guide, what do you wish the United States knew about what's going on the ground right now? And she said, we are two nations of children. The children are all in trauma. We are governed by children, and all we really need is an adult. And so we said, well, what does an adult look like? And she said, Joe Biden is the adult in the room right now. And the two examples was, number one, sending a carrier group is what adults do. Number two, sanctioning the right-wing settlers is what adults do. And like, the importance of that stuff, what it means on the ground, like, you can't overstate that.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. And this leads to another question, the possibility of President Biden as the adult in the room. And I'd love to have your thoughts digging in a little bit more on the issue of U.S. leadership if we are to actually see a resolution to this conflict. What kind of leadership do you think will be necessary to really bring about a resolution to this conflict? And is there the political bandwidth for it? We know that if, God forbid, Donald Trump is elected in November, I mean, you can absolutely forget it. You'll have Jared Kushner's plan or something. I would imagine actually it would be worse. I don't think you'll even get the plan from the first Trump administration. But do you see, even with a President Biden, do you really see the bandwidth the hands-on support that would be forthcoming. Let me ask you this. God willing, we'll have sorry, I haven't been talking into the mic. God willing, we will have a second term for President Biden. Do you think in a second term, after election is out of the way, would there be more political space for the Biden administration to really devote to solving this issue?
So yes, my slight hesitation is I think that the realist in me says, okay, Netanyahu clearly would like Trump to win and is clearly going to try to string out his lifeline as long as he can. The last thing we want is for what's going on to continue through November, but it's also hard for me to see the U.S. having the kind of leverage to bring this forward. There's just so much more leverage the day after the election where Biden has won, and the Israeli government, however they may constitute at that point, says these are the people we're dealing with for the next 4 years. And I think there's a lot of leverage there in that moment. I think in the broader diplomatic sense, everything that your last speakers were talking about, I don't think the U.S. is the indispensable partner. Who's going to bring the Jordanians, the Emiratis, the Qataris, the Saudis, the Israelis, the PA, who's got the credibility to bring them all to the table? And it's us or it's nobody, realistically. I think we're all sort of still very hopeful that maybe this big grand bargain is still out there and available. In some ways, maybe it's a little easier now because the war has gone on so long. I mean, I think there was a lot of concern early on. Do we start talking about two-state solution again, or would that reward Hamas for October 7th? I think at this point, no one's coming out of this getting praised for whatever comes next. So I think the U.S. has that role. I think certainly Jake Sullivan's team has done an exceptional job, at least as far as I'm briefed on it, on keeping that possible. But it's hard for me to see something before November. I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah. So another question from the audience. You have a large Palestinian constituency. There's a very robust Palestinian constituency here in the Chicago area and within your district in particular. What are you hearing from your Palestinian American constituents, and how do you engage with them on this issue?
So number one, I'm very reluctant to stereotype everybody. Little Palestine is in my district, Bridgeview, Palos, that area. Almost all of my meetings with that group prior to October 7th with those individuals were meetings about small business owners. It was funny when the maps were redrawn. I didn't have that community before, but I used to represent Oak Brook and areas up there. And I remember the first time I went to one of the mosques down there, they said, "We really want you to understand Muslim issues." And I sort of joked. I said, "Oh, I totally understand all your issues." And they said, "No, our issues are going to be a little different than the one you represented before." And before it was mostly South Asian. And I said, "No, it's exactly the same. You're pissed off about lines that the British drew on a map in the 1920s, 1930s. Do I have this about right?" It's the same issue, really. Those issues were there before. I think one of the really hard conversations that I had before October 7th, we were meeting with these Arab American business leaders, and I said, if you all were eligible to vote in the next Palestinian election, who wins in the Bridgeview Palos area, Hamas or Fatah? And they said, "You're not going to like our answer." And they said they said Fatah is completely corrupt. We see them as useless. We don't all agree with the way that Hamas is resisting, but we're going to vote for the party who's resisting. And that's a hard thing, right? And I think you and I were chatting at the start. What is the identity of a putative state who has been defined by the Nakba, right? Except in opposition to Israel. And how do you create sort of not that it's ours to create, right? But how do we as human beings end up creating a narrative of a Palestinian identity that is not designed in contrast to something else? And I don't know how to answer that, and I'm not proud of the way that I've even engaged with all my constituents on that, because it gets to be those hard conversations that say, we support you on these 10 other issues. Let's park that one. But it's a really hard issue.
Yeah, and so let me ask this. Something I don't know the answer. I'm very curious to hear the answer. Let's say President Biden goes beyond, the speech that he gave on May 31st, which was a great step with the 3-part plan. Let's say he, along the lines of what J Street has been asking, goes further and lays out the path to resolving this conflict, establishing a Palestinian state, broader, comprehensive regional security framework. Do you think that the folks in your district who you just talked about, the Palestinian constituents in your district, who are extremely angry right now, who, even given, if you give them just the binary between Fatah and Hamas, will unfortunately choose Hamas, would they be supportive, do you think, of a Biden effort like that? Would that change the way that they're looking at President Biden's foreign policy to this point? I know this is a hypothetical, but...
Well, so, again, I don't want to speak, all 30,000 constituents are the same, but maybe just sort of 2 vignettes of constituent services requests that we have had, one before October 7th, one after. Before October 7th, I've had a number of constituent requests saying, can you please do something to help me, because my family has owned land in the West Bank for generations. We cannot get clear title. It's being seized from us. Can you do something to try to preserve this ability? Can you help me find a way to go and visit my relatives without having to fly into Amman and come across the border, because this is a big these are real practical day-to-day issues, and the world you described, those issues kind of go away, right? That's a big deal, right? To go back, to see your family, to see the land that your grandparents grew up on. Since October 7th, we have spent quite a bit of time trying to help constituents who had families who were visiting family members in Gaza on October 7th, could not get out, were then captured by the IDF and were being held in Israeli prisons for indefinite periods without due process. And we need help. Ultimately ended up having to work directly with Jack Lew to get some of these folks taken care of. But that issue again.
Jack Lew being the U.S. ambassador
yes,
in Israel.
Yeah. I should mention J Street helped facilitate that introduction, so thank you. Thank you when we were over there. But that conversation at the time, we had constituents saying, we need you to get these people out. They haven't done anything wrong. They need to be taken out of these prisons. And we said what we would say to anybody from any country. Look, we don't, as a congressional office, get involved in specific allegations of crimes in other countries, weighing into we'll do everything we can to communicate, to make sure that they've got humanitarian assistance, clean clothes, but that's the extent of what we could do. At which they said, well, you didn't treat the hostages that way. You interfered when they, why is this different? And I can't, as an empathetic human being, I can't say that they don't have a point. Again, that issue is tenable only to the degree that one of these entities is a state and the other is a terrorist organization, right? If they're both states, that issue goes away. So, does that speak to everybody? I don't know, but I think a lot of sort of the regular daily nuisances of being a stateless person, I think a lot of that goes away, and I think would see facts on the ground change.
So I'm going to ask you another specific...
It's a very crass way to do it, but you take my point.
Yeah, no, indeed. Let me ask you another specific policy question that was, that's currently a major issue, including in terms of a vote that happened just last week in the House. It has to do with the ICC. And the ICC prosecutor announcing that he's plans to bring, or he's requesting warrants for the arrest of 3 senior Hamas leaders, and also for Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Gallant. This, of course, immediately became a major issue within Congress, and there was a Republican-led initiative that did get some bipartisan support to impose sanctions not only on ICC officials, but that would go far beyond that. Very problematic piece of legislation that J Street strongly opposed. How do you see this particular issue playing? Why did this become such a lightning rod in Congress? And what do you think is the path forward in terms of the ICC case?
So look, anything that happens that is adversarial to the government of Israel between now and the next election, I can guarantee you there will be some show vote called to weaponize and divide the Democratic Party that will be brought to the floor by Mike Johnson. That's just going to happen, right? So it wasn't surprising. I think the way that Chip Roy worded this particular resolution, if one wanted to believe that he was most upset that the ICC had sanctioned Vladimir Putin and wanted to take that away, he should have worded it exactly as he worded it, right? Like, I mean, this essentially said that anybody who assists the ICC, so all of our allies who fund them, any U.S. company that has if Accenture has a contract, we would be sanctioning people. You would basically cripple the ICC, who is going after a lot of people. Now that's
including Hamas.
Exactly. Now that's a completely separate question from, I think, the false equivalence between what Hamas did on October 7th was unjustified. What Israel did after October 7th, we can argue whether they went too far, but they were absolutely justified. If they don't have the right to defend their own borders and defend their own citizens and get their citizens back, they aren't a government, right? And so I think there's a conversation about whether the ICC overplayed their hand. I think if this was a vote about policy and not about a gotcha vote to try to see if we can split the Democratic Party, the wording would have been much more constrained to narrowly focus on the question of is Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant guilty of war crimes, as opposed to let's cripple the ICC.
So, I mean, I think you make an absolutely unimpeachable point that clearly the Republicans, the GOP, and the House, Speaker Johnson, are trying to do everything they can to use this issue as a wedge in the Democratic Party. What would you say to your colleagues about how the party can unite to avoid being wedged by the Republicans?
So first off, for a whole lot of reasons, we have to get the House back. If you want democracy to end, put Mike Johnson in charge of certifying the election next January 6th, right? So my immediate answer to that question is I want every Democrat who's sitting in Congress right now to do what they think is necessary to win their next election, right? And what works in one district is going to be different from what works in another, and we can go through, we can go through from there. And I'm forgetting that. Remind me that you're.
Yeah. So the question is just how can Democrats guard against being divided on this issue?
I guess I still don't know how to answer that except in every individual district, right? Because I think if we're doing our job right, we're not all going to be singing from the same hymnal, right? We're going to be responding to the individual parts of our district, and they're going to keep finding opportunities. Certainly, July 24th is the next one, right? I I have traveled to more kibbutzes that were attacked on October 7th than Benjamin Netanyahu has. And yet Benjamin Netanyahu is being invited to address Congress, which is a stick in the eye, and goodness knows there's going to be a lot of drama about how that plays out. But these things are going to keep coming up, and the way that I can talk about it because of my constituents, because of whatever eloquence J Street has bequeathed on me is going to be different than what Josh Gottheimer can say, right? But I want to make sure that we hold those gavels next term so that we can do the real work that needs to be done.
So we're going to need to kind of start wrapping up here, but you bring up July 24th, which is now the date that's on the books for Prime Minister Netanyahu coming to speak to Congress. I'm sure many of us in this room remember what happened the last time around back in 2015 when Prime Minister Netanyahu came to try to sink the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. Unfortunately, he failed then. So how do you see this speech on July 24th? What are the Republicans hoping for, do you think, out of this speech? And what should be the Democratic approach to Netanyahu coming to speak to Congress?
I was afraid you were going to ask that question when I got here this morning because I really struggle with that one. As a member, do I attend? Do I go and make a show of walking out? Do I go with a giant hostage tag to remind him of, I don't know. And how are our colleagues going to do that? I do find it just deeply personally offensive that this is being used as a political stunt. I mean, whatever this room thinks of AIPAC has long had a view that support for Israel has to be bipartisan. You do not bring Netanyahu, who is struggling to hold on to power in Israel, who has been very open about his proclivities, his desires in the American electorate. You don't bring him here if you're trying to make sure that Israel remains a bipartisan issue. You bring him here if you are trying to use Israel to weaponize an election. And it's going to be hard to put that genie back in the bottle when the Netanyahu era finally comes to an end. Those divisions are still going to be there, right? And we've got to find a way, I think, with what we do in this moment to be trying to make sure that what we're doing is building the foundation for what we have to rebuild and not getting caught up in the immediate moment of this feels like the right thing to do now because this person made me angry and this might help my poll numbers next week. And I don't know quite what that looks like, but I guess that scares me because I don't know that any of us have quite figured that out yet, but it's important.
Yeah. And I'll just mention on the Netanyahu speech issue that there have been a number of Israelis, including our executive director, Nadav Tamir, who I'm sure you know from the J Street trips, Amir Tibon, a columnist for Haaretz who lived, basically was under attack from Hamas on October 7th, who have written and said that, unfortunately, the embrace of Netanyahu in Washington, bringing him here, giving him this platform, is really a stick in the eye to Israeli liberals and what they are doing, what they've been, the protest movement against the Netanyahu government. So, from that perspective, from their perspective, obviously this is a very, problematic development.
Can I just share?
Yeah.
I'd said this to you outside.
Yeah, please.
When we were to get some sense of sort of where the politics are over there, we met with Ron Dermer. Leave it at that.
I know you have thoughts about Ron Dermer.
I have more colorful adjectives I usually put in front of his name. And we said to him, you've got to do something to allow these aid trucks to get into Gaza, because they were all being blocked, they couldn't get through. And Dermer said to us, the only reason those aid trucks aren't able to get through is because advocates for the hostages are showing up at the gates and blocking them from getting through because they think that the Israeli government should not be prioritizing the hostages and should not be prioritizing aid until the hostages are free. complete and utter BS. We knew it was BS. He knew he was lying. He knew that we knew he was lying, right? And it's like just a massive diplomatic failure, I think, to lie to somebody when they know you're lying to them. But I tell you that story because you could see immediately who the political brains of Netanyahu's operation sees as their biggest liability. It's those damn lefty hostage families, right? And that's where his political pressure is coming in the street. And I say that to your point of, how is it not massively disrespectful? You drive through Tel Aviv, you drive through Jerusalem, you come into the airport and you see the posters everywhere. And how is it not disrespectful to say the person who won't even meet with the families gets to come to Congress?
Very well framed. So we're going to have to say goodbye to you, Congressman. Well, we're going to have to wrap up generally in just a moment. But if you could, speak to this crowd about what we can all do to most proactively, effectively engage on this issue, what would you say to our audience here today?
This sounds trite, but keep doing what you're doing. Like, there's so many of you in this room who I've gotten to know and considered friends. Some of you who I've, is Richard still here? Where's Rich? There you go. Who I've not only traveled in Israel with, but you've run me through hills and beat the snot out of my legs, proving that I'm not as good a runner as I used to be, and the hills of Jerusalem are bigger than the hills of Downers Grove. But the education, the resources is fantastic. I'm just super grateful for it, and I think continuing to be that Frederick Douglass voice, right? And just remind people that you can love Israel, you can love America by pushing us both to be better.
Thank you so much, Congressman Casten. We are so fortunate to have you in Congress. So fortunate to have you as a friend of J Street. So fortunate for what you do on this issue, on the climate, on so many issues, reproductive rights, so many things. This is one thing that, a lot of, when I speak to diplomats, for example, one thing that they often don't understand is that the issue of Israel is not, the number one top thing. We care about it, but we also care about so many issues, and you are engaged on the correct side of so many of those things, and we appreciate your work on all of them. And with that said, I want to call Lance Friedman up here to say a few words. Thank you so much, Congressman.
Can I use this mic, Jody? Can you guys hear me? Okay. Well, as Debra just told you, I'm Lance Friedman. I'm a member of Mishkan Chicago, one of the other organizations, in addition to Beth Emmett, that is co-sponsoring this event. And I've been a J Street supporter really just for about a couple of years. I am personally, and you heard it from Congressman Casten, I'm personally really happy that J Street's voice is being heard at the highest levels of U.S. policymaking these days. And it doesn't mean that the policy comes out perfectly, but I do believe that because J Street is at the table, it's better than it otherwise might have been. About 100 years ago, a Chinese writer said this about hope. Hope is like a path in the countryside. Originally, there is nothing, but as people walk that way again and again, a path appears. And this day has been about describing that path so that we all can walk it again and again and again until it becomes real. This day has also been a little bit about each of us finding something useful to help us decide for ourselves, what do we think? And to help with that, there's a piece of paper that was on your chair when you arrived, and it has two simple questions on it. You can take a look at it if you'd like to. What is, from this discussion today that you heard, what is one thing that will stick with you? And has anything shifted in your thinking as a result of what you've heard this morning? Just take a minute, think about those two questions, and during the reception, when we're all going to get some wonderful food to eat, maybe talk to a friend or a family member or maybe even a total stranger, compare notes, and see what you might learn from each other. Now, on the flip side of that card are a variety of actions that you could take to stay informed about the situation. I think we all feel like we really learned a lot this morning. There are ways to stay informed, as simple as signing up to get J Street's daily news roundup, which I think is excellent and quick, to having discussions with friends, and including financial support for J Street, which is, of course, a nonprofit. I just want to tell you why I have chosen to support J Street. I think their approach of influencing the U.S. to influence Israel is smart. It's been a little tough lately to make that influence have the effect we'd like to see, but I really believe that that strategy will ultimately work. And I also feel, and I think you saw it today from Debra, that their policy recommendations are nuanced approaches to defining what it means today to be pro-Israel, pro-peace, and pro-democracy. So take a look at that card, tick the boxes next to each action that you're interested in, and we gave you a choice of yes and even maybe, so you're not making too much of a commitment. And drop your card in one of the boxes by the exit as you leave. Before I hand it off to Rabbi London to wrap us up, I want to also thank, as Debra did at the beginning, the J Street team in Chicago and D.C., especially Marina Samach, who stepped up in a big way. To be point person on this event, and of course to our incisive and engaging moderator, Debra Shushan. Yasher Koach, Marina, and Debra. Over to you, Rabbi London.
Wow, this has been an incredible event. Thank you again to Dr. Debra Shushan, and of course to Congressman Sean Casten. Your leadership, how clearly you can articulate these issues is very impressive, and that you're really trying to help us to find a resolution. And also thank you to our speakers, to Professor Aryeh Kasowitz, and to, I'm going to pronounce her name, Farah Badur. Wonderful. And I also have to really give a big shout out to my team here. We've never been successful in actually having Zoom technology that works in the sanctuary. And so to Becky Kaplan and Jody Litwack, who made it happen. And to coming on a Sunday morning in the summer to be able to do this, I'm so appreciative. We have the best staff here. And also I think we need to acknowledge our regional director here for J Street in Chicago, Noah Finkelstein, who's been an amazing leader. I have been part of the J Street Rabbinic Cabinet since J Street's inception. I began my activism on Israel-Palestine peace in 1987. I know I don't look like I'm old enough, but I am. 1987, I was spending the year in Israel, and the first Intifada broke out a week after I came back to the United States. And ever since that moment, I knew that I had a role that I needed to play, and have worked with various organizations over many, many years. And I'm really proud to be part of J Street. I have just finished 8 years as co-chair of the Rabbinic Cantorial Cabinet at J Street. I had my last meeting just last week. It feels rather bittersweet, but it doesn't mean that I will not be continuing to be involved with J Street. J Street has been meaningful to me because, again, as Lance has spoken about, it's really a place in which we can, as Americans, have an influence on our government here, to have an influence on what happens in Israel in a positive way. You had that amazing quote by Frederick Douglass, which I won't be able to repeat, but there is also the same concept within our Torah, within Jewish tradition. And so I would like to quote that as we close from Parashat Kedoshim in the book of Leviticus. We read, "Ve'ahavta re'echa kamocha," you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But sometimes we don't read the line that precedes it, Right? What does it mean to love our neighbor as ourselves? Does it mean that whatever our neighbor does, we say, yeah, that's great, good job? It might mean that, but it also, as the line that preceded says, "Hocheach tocheach et amitecha." You shall reprove your neighbor if they're not behaving in the way they should behave. And that you do that because you love them. And that's what Frederick Douglass was teaching. And so we do this work because we love Israel. Because without standing up and saying these are the things that are wrong, we're not going to see a better future. And that to be pro-peace and justice and to be pro-Israel necessitates that we must be pro-Palestinian as well. That as I began by saying, our futures, our destinies are bound up with each other. J Street understands that we need to understand the situation in a nuanced and complicated way, and that when we reprove Israel and when we reprove our own government for things it doesn't do right, it's because, as Congressman Sean Casten says, we want it to do better, and we love it. We love this country, we love Israel, and we want to see a better future for everyone there. This is what J Street represents, not only in ideology, but also in practical steps on the ground, both here and in Israel. Thank you to J Street for all that you represent, and thank you for an amazing program. Now, I've been told that there is a lot of food, and so you have to stay and you have to eat all of the food. Becky Kaplan has told me, please do that. There's also a group here of Friends of Standing Together that joined us today, and please get some food, but also I think there's going to be a picnic at the park that's a block away. Hila Ratzabi and Kathy Bender will lead us to the park too for people who want to participate in that. Great to have everyone here. Thank you.